With the Granville Acts, we now see the first attempt to implement taxation and levy it against the North American colonies. And before you is a picture of George Grenville. He is the prime minister during this time, and he is obviously tasked with the responsibility of trying to solve um, this financial insolvency that the British Empire is facing. Let's recall that this was a war that was global in scope, very costly, and therefore, despite the victory, the great victory that put England pretty much on top of the hierarchy in terms of European empires, it also meant that they're staring into the abyss of economic disaster. So this was a pressing matter, very urgent, and Grenville has to try to solve this. Now, first of all, when it comes to taxation, it bears repeating here that it's not only the North American colonies that are going to be targeted for taxation. Taxes are going to be levied against practically all English subjects. That includes Irish colonials, um, obviously people in England, right, Scotland, and certainly in North America and other colonies, like let's say in the Caribbean. Now, it also bears repeating that the North American colonials were the least taxed population in the entire English Empire. And in a way, we already know this because they're used to having this hands off approach that was pretty much assumed by Parliament since the beginning. If you recall the policy of salutary neglect, this was a political approach, really, political and economic, actually, whereby it was felt that if Parliament just left the colonies alone to their own devices, so to say, well, ultimately this will be beneficial to the English Empire, especially economically. And that's indeed what happened. As I keep mentioning, the North American colonies by the 18th century, the mid 18th century, are going to be these very important commercial capitals of that transatlantic trade system. So, again, the colonials are the least taxed population. And even the taxation schemes that are going to be drawn by Parliament and by legislators, it'll usually be the case that the colonials, in terms of their tax rate, will um, not experience the same tax rate, the higher tax rate of other colonials. In fact, the Irish are going to be taxed higher, okay, than the colonials in North America. This is likely due to the fact that Parliament is aware of their early approach of hands off, and they want to be kind of careful with the colonies, right? But as you can imagine, despite the fact that these taxation laws are going to be slight in comparison to other colonial populations in the world, or rather in the Empire of England, it'll remain the case that the colonials will respond very defiantly to them. Okay, so that's the Granville Acts that we will begin discussing. And here are four acts associated with the Granville Acts. And again, these are specific to the North American colonies, the 13 colonies. Okay, so let's go through each one and see what they involve and how they arouse the ire and resentment of the colonials in North America. Okay, the first one is the Sugar Act, and it's passed right then and there in 1763. And look at that. It lowered duties. Now, duties, in case you don't know, are basically taxes placed upon trade items, right? So it lowered taxes or duties on sugar imports, on English sugar going into the colonies. All right. So on the face of it, it doesn't seem that lowering taxes will lead to defiance. But that's not really the most controversial part from the viewpoint of colonials. The controversy lay with a particular provision that was asserted by Grenville in the attempt to make the colonials abide by the Navigation Acts. And just a reminder about the Navigation Acts. I suggest you look it up in your textbook, by the way. But the Navigation Acts were passed before the 7 Years' War. There's a series of them. And if you recall the policy of mercantilism, the attempt was to make sure the English keep trade enclosed. You don't want to trade, in other words, with the Spanish, the French. You want to keep it English only, and that way you don't become ensnared in a relation of dependency, economically speaking, should you go to war. Now, the colonies being so far away, and coupled with the fact that they're used to very lax supervision, right, from Parliament and the King, well, they didn't really abide by mercantilism. And Parliament by the 1830s felt there was a need to pass some acts to keep laws, that is, to keep the colonies from smuggling stuff in and so on and so forth. So they passed the Navigation Acts to try to regulate the trade on the seas, right? And try to make sure the colonials basically relegated their trade activities to English only. But it didn't really work. The colonials developed a habit of maintaining their trade with the French, maintaining their trade with the Dutch or Spain or whatever European traders were there in North America. But they just did it more sneakily. They did it undercover, right? And though the Navigation Acts were passed before the war, they weren't really enforced by the English. So there you go. It's almost this nominal legislation, right, that wasn't truly enforced. Now, what Grenville is doing with that provision placed under the Sugar Act is attempt to put some teeth, if you will, into the regulation, whereby, he wanted to keep the colonials from trading with other countries. Okay, and here's how it went. Basically, if you were caught smuggling other imports from other countries, well, you had to appear before a court. And this court was located, by the way, in Nova Scotia. You had to travel all the way there. Let's say if you were busted in Georgia or South Carolina, you still had to make your way all the way traveling north to Nova Scotia. And you had to appear before a trial. And moreover, it was a juryless trial, no jury. Well, obviously, this flies in the face of, the sense of justice, right? A just trial that the colonials felt must happen. So they will protest loudly against this provision. But again, from Grenville's perspective, he is trying to enforce the Navigation Acts. He's trying to tell the colonials, from now on, you will not be involved in smuggling. Okay, so that's the controversial part of the Sugar Act. Now, the next one is the Currency Act. And this was passed in 1764, shortly after the Sugar Act. And as stated there, it prohibited the issuance of colonial currency. Now, in the colonies, there was no central bank, needless to say. Let's remember decentralization. That applied to banking also. Currency. Each colony had its own currency. And in fact, if you were a colonial at the time within any of the 13 colonies, what you saw circulating was not only your colonial currency, but even, of course, the English pound, the sterling pound was circulating. But probably the strongest currency, believe it or not, was the Spanish dollar. Okay, Spain had its own currency, of course, and the Spanish dollar was the strongest currency there in the colonies. So again, all these currencies circulating. It's not like today where we only have one currency that's issued by our bank today, the Federal Reserve. We all have the same, $20 bills and $5 bills and $100 bills. Back then, a variety of currencies. But the colonial currency was certainly around. And here comes Granville and says, from now on, you cannot print your currency or coin your currency. Okay, so this affects the colonies in two ways. Economically, it meant that whoever had that colonial currency had to convert it somehow, and the actual currency was devalued, so they would get less if they tried to convert it into, let's say, the English pound. Okay, they could no longer pay their debts, for example, with colonial currency; it would be rejected. They could, needless to say, they couldn't buy English products anymore because it was deemed invalid. But also, aside from economics, symbolically, what this meant was that that colonial institution, which is, currency, is being dismissed by Parliament. Okay, so symbolically, it means that this local institution means nothing to Parliament from now on. What it is a show of authority from Parliament, symbolically speaking, right? You are taking away a local institution, in this case, colonial currency, and saying that it's no longer valid in our eyes. Now, again, in keeping with that theme of decentralization and so forth, you can see how the colonials are going to react to this, right? They're going to hate it. And, you start seeing building resentment, right? So with the other two, you see quartering, and we already discussed this, how during the 7 Years' War, Parliament required colonials to house English troops and to provide them with supplies and food and what have you during the war. But now the war ends, but there are still a lot of English troops in North America. So therefore, Parliament requires that this Quartering Act continue even after the war. Now, as I discussed, colonials hate this. Even though they're obviously in support of the army, they're proud to be fighting with the army, but they don't like their privacy to be invaded. So the fact that Granville is extending the Quartering Act leads to further feelings of revolt and rebellion, and at the very least, resentment against England. And that leads us to the fourth, the Stamp Act. And I think it's safe to assume that out of the four, this is probably the most controversial, the Stamp Act. Now, this is interesting because it only was directed towards a certain segment of the colonial population. But first of all, let me describe what the Stamp Act is. Basically, it required that for any official document in the colonies, a special paper had to be used for it to be legitimate. Okay, and this paper was purchased from the English, right? And that's how the English gathered their tax, right? That's how they levied the tax. They based it on the sale of this paper, which was to be used to make any document official. So, what are we talking about when we refer to official documents? We're talking about business invoices. We're talking about legal documents like court papers and even wills and even diplomas. We're talking about, in some cases, some newspapers. We're talking about, doctors. If you're a physician, you have certain documents, right? So anything that, again, that had to be official had to be printed on this special paper. Now, here's the stamp that was affixed on the corner of this paper, this official paper, and it obviously cost 2 shillings and 6 pence here. All right. And again, let me remind you, these measures apply obviously to North America. only. Okay, now going back to that segment of the population who was affected by this, it should be obvious to you who it affected. It's not the yeoman farmer, of course. Okay, the yeoman farmer, that small farmer who didn't own slaves and were, barely getting by on a small piece of land. Well, they didn't really need official paper for hardly anything. Okay, so it doesn't affect them. And let me remind you, pretty much the majority of the population, if you look demographically or statistically speaking, it's the yeoman farmer that comprise the majority of the population. But then again, if you go to a place like Philadelphia and you just look at that locale, perhaps there's more, or let's say less yeoman farmers. But nonetheless, across the board, yeoman farmers, the majority of the population, were the least affected by the Stamp Act. The most affected were obviously the professional classes, to use that term. We're talking about successful shop owners or storekeepers and business people who needed business invoices. And we're talking about doctors, we're talking about lawyers, journalists, people that are involved in the public sphere, who need that official documentation on a regular basis. So they're forced to buy that paper to make it official, right? So here's the thing, they're a small segment or a smaller segment of the population in the colonies, but they're among the more powerful ones. Okay, they're professional, they're members of the public sphere most likely, and many of them were to be our founding fathers. Okay, so therefore, what's going to happen is they're going to complain loudly about the Stamp Act. And let's recall the public sphere. The public sphere is set into action, right? What you had happening were town meetings. Okay, this is a tradition in America, of course, happening as far back as the colonial era, and it's still around today. All right, the town meetings. It's part of civil society, whereby people in this democratic country meet at a local level, right, and decide on issues. Town meetings. Okay, so you have town meetings being held and attended by it's a public sphere where the issue is discussed. And importantly, what happens is the spread of this defiance through newspapers, of course, as we discussed, but also things like political pamphlets and so forth. So what's happening is the spread of this message by those in the public sphere that the Stamp Act is a violation of freedom. Okay, again, the reason why is this powerful yet small portion of the population has the means to do so, the wherewithal. So what you see here is really what you could call propaganda. In fact, here is a poster basically calling the Stamp Act as a violation of their freedom. It says an emblem of the effects of the stamp, of the fatal stamp. And of course, there are skull and crossbones there. And it's supposed to symbolize what? Death, right? And, maybe not literally, but they're certainly talking about the death of freedom here, right? Taxation leading to violation of, quote, their property. That is to say, unfair taxation. Okay, so again, this is what's being propagated through things like political pamphlets and newspapers, and it's going to spread to those who are not affected or least affected by the Stamp Act, and it's going to frame it or couch it in the language of a violation of freedom. So even though they're not directly hurt, that's to say, the yeoman farmer again, it's going to galvanize the population, a lot of the colonial population, into action, into being defiant. And at the most radical expression of this, you're going to see in Boston, for example, the formation of the Sons of Liberty. You may have heard of that. It's this patriotic group led by Samuel Adams, who was a cousin of John Adams, who would become our second president and certainly a founding father of ours. And they would get involved in protests. And when I say protests back then, I'm talking about riots. Okay, I'm talking about burning down the tax collector's house, destruction of property, tarring and feathering. If you haven't heard of that, they would go see someone who sympathized with the British or was a tax collector, and pour hot tar on them, and then take a box of feathers and pour it over the tar, right? Tarring. It was symbolic public shame, is what it was. Okay, so it was violent, actually. The Sons of Liberty were violent during the entire period of the colonial crisis. And, this again underscores the fact that protest and rioting is actually fundamental to our history. Okay, whether this or the working class against the capitalist class during the 18th century, not to mention the 20th century with all the different social movements then. Okay, so this is what's being spread throughout the colonies. The message that this is a violation of freedom. Now, what's going to happen, and I'll discuss it in the next video, is the formation of what's called the Stamp Act Congress. And this Congress was populated by influential colonial leaders who are going to formulate an argument against the Stamp Act to be directed towards Parliament. Now, they're not literally going to get on a ship and argue against Parliament in England, but they're going to form this argument basically saying why the Stamp Act is illegal, and not only that, it's a violation of their English freedom. Keyword English, because of course there's still English subjects here. So this will be the topic of our next video.